Kia ora koutou. Thanks for having me. Ko Adam Maho. I'm a restoration ecologist, and I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about or discussing the why, what and how of ecological restoration and biodiversity management. So hopefully most people here are aware that we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. At the last figures I looked at, more than 47% of our native species are currently classified as either at risk or threatened with extinction, and about 5.5% are actually critically endangered, so on the brink of extinction. Ecosystems across the country, there's many ecosystems that have less than 10% of their historical extent, and particularly in lowland areas it's often less than 3%. So that's part of the why. Then it comes down to, all right, how do we fix this? Broadly speaking, there's sort of 5 overarching tasks that we need to undertake to really get our biodiversity back on track. First of all, identify key sites. This has largely already been done by councils around the country, identifying SNAs or SEAs or KNEs or whatever they might be called in your region. Once those key sites are identified, then it's time to go to work. Working ideally from the good areas to the bad areas and looking after what we have. First of all, protecting them through things like covenants and policies, so that those high value sites don't get converted to other land use. Then it's time to start maintaining those sites, looking after what we have essentially, and making sure those high value sites don't go backwards. Restoration then goes beyond maintenance, and it's working to improve degraded sites, and then lastly reconnecting sites so that things like fauna and seed can move between. So it's been recognised for a while that we need to do some restoration work. These are just a couple of recent policy statements that have also sort of recognised the fact, the main one there being the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity that was recently released, which has the requirement in there for regional councils to set targets for territorial authorities of a minimum of 10% Indigenous cover. So I think something I kind of often pick up on is people don't really understand what restoration is. Technically, restoration is assisting nature to recover assisting the recovery of a degraded, damaged or destroyed ecosystem, ideally back to what it was pre-human, essentially, to the pre-human state. The Society for Ecological Restoration a few years back released the International Principles for Ecological Restoration and identified 8 principles that underpin good restoration. Things like engaging stakeholders, drawing on many types of knowledge, assessed against clear goals and objectives, gains cumulative value when applied at larger scales. Those are all pretty self-explanatory, I think, but things like informed by native reference ecosystems, that's essentially making sure we're using reference sites or benchmark sites to guide our goals and our actions. Supports ecosystem recovery, that's around working with nature to allow it to recover. Seeks the highest level of recovery possible. That comes back to reference ecosystems really, and just working to as close as possible back to those reference conditions. And 8, restoration is part of a continuum of restorative activities. So it sits within a spectrum, restoration being the ideal goal, and then other activities like rehabilitation and remediation are providing benefit, but they're not quite restoration. So things like creating a stormwater wetland or planting native plantings along an expressway, they're beneficial, but they're not restoration. So that's kind of the guiding principles. Then when it comes to the work on the ground, there's typically 3 approaches we can take to do our restoration. natural regeneration, assisted regeneration, and ecosystem reconstruction. Natural regeneration is the method that requires the least input from humans. That's essentially sites where there's a really good native seed source nearby, and it naturally regenerates to a native dominated ecosystem with very few weeds around. More commonly what happens is sites will develop naturally with a mix of native plants and exotic plants or weeds. So they need a bit of help to get to give the vegetation a push in the right direction, basically back to where the trajectory that we want it to go on. And then ecosystem reconstruction, though it's sites where there's pretty much no native seed source nearby, and we basically have to rebuild that ecosystem from scratch. Coming back to the principle of working with nature, ideally we want to be trying to push for the natural regeneration and the assisted regeneration. Natural regeneration's not very common. You need to have a really sort of nice surrounding landscape. But what seems to happen is we're really sort of pushing for the ecosystem reconstruction rather than the assisted regeneration. When we look at these different approaches with a sort of relatively simple cost-benefit analysis of the three, cost-wise, there's not too much difference. The main, has this got a pointer? Oh, no, okay. The main cost is really ongoing weed maintenance, looking after what you've got. There's a bit of an upfront expense for reconstruction, for planting typically, and assisted regeneration often has a bit of an expense for the initial weeding of the site. The real advantage of assisted regeneration and natural regeneration really comes when we're thinking about the timeframes for ecological improvements. At a reconstruction site, you might plant 4,000 native plants, but they're all little plants, and the ecological condition of that site is still relatively poor for a couple of decades because it's just young vegetation. It's not really providing that much sort of in the way of habitat. On the other hand, regen sites will often have some established vegetation already that you're working with. So that time frame can be often, not always, drawn down to a couple of years when you've finally got an ecosystem that's providing some decent value. Yeah, so as I mentioned, something I see a lot of is that we're really prioritising reconstruction over assisted regeneration. So I'll run through a couple of examples. This is a site here. It has an approved management plan as part of a resource consent, and the management plan has identified these three sites for restoration. The two on the left are largely covered in herbaceous weeds, mostly blue morning glory. The site down the bottom that has a mix of exotic trees and areas of bamboo, some ferns and Tradescantia in the understory. And then the area in the middle there was planted out by the neighbouring school about 10 to 15 years ago. The management plan says something like, we've chosen these sites because they're the most degraded and therefore have the greatest potential for improvement. It's not wrong, they do have the greatest potential for improvement. The trouble is, the area in the middle, there's nothing protecting it necessarily, and if the maintenance change or the management changes, we could lose that site that's already halfway towards being restored. And that's essentially what we've started to see over the last couple of years. Blue morning glory has swept through this patch here and is threatening that area really. So while the areas that we're working on are improving, that area is going backwards. Skip through this one a bit quick, but this is a site identified for restoration. A environmental engineer took over and decided that he essentially was going to clear most of the site, not working with what we've got, and certainly not working with nature. Not essentially clearing what we were trying to protect or recreate. This site had quite a few thousand plants planted through it, and at the same time there were several hectares with existing vegetation being strangled and outcompeted by vines and other weeds. At least the plantings are getting some maintenance and looked after, but a better approach would have been get on top of the weeds, see how the vegetation responds, and then infill plant as needed. So those are, looking after what we've got and working with nature. They're nice philosophies, but when it actually comes to work on the ground, how do you actually do that? Can really be split up into two overarching sort of categories of actions: vegetation management and fauna management. I'll focus mostly on veg management because for most restoration projects that's the main task. Apart from pest animal control, obviously it's a big one, but yeah, I'll focus on veg management. So it's really looking after our native plants, dealing to the weeds, and adding native plants as needed. Vegetation management, coming back to the high level strategy stuff. Know what your long-term goals are and keep that in the back of your mind while you're doing your work. Look after what you have, protect what you've got, and then really focus your efforts on the key weeds that are really going to threaten the long-term survivability of that vegetation. What we call transformative weeds, so weeds that have the ability to take over a site and persist. Things like willows, privets, Tradescantia, Japanese honeysuckle, things like that. Then know your plants. This is probably the biggest thing to learn for restoration practitioners. Know your native species, know your weeds, know how they grow, their physiology, and know where they sit within the successional process, so you can sort of know when to reintroduce them and things like that. And then lastly, the real nitty gritty stuff. Know your tools, know your techniques, so your drills, your saws, spades, knapsacks, spray guns, herbicides, non-selective versus selective, know when to use them and how to use them. So really, I think what a lot of people think of is restoration can be done by anyone, but it's actually quite a skill to have to be a good restoration practitioner. Yeah, that's me. I think 10% goal. It's a big target in a lot of areas. That's going to be thousands of hectares of restoration. A massive challenge, but I'm confident we can do it. Yeah, feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss any more. But thanks for having me.
A couple of questions come through.
All right, that top one. It's really site specific. Depending on the landscape, there's not necessarily any reason it's not achievable if you've got 500 years. In plenty of places, it is going to be difficult. In a lot of lowland areas, the landscape's been changed quite a lot, drained and whatnot. Also, with the drainage, it changes the whole hydrology of how rivers, sort of the floodplains are affected and stuff as well. But I think the goal is to work as close to as possible to get to that. And I'm approaching this from a very idealistic restoration ecologist perspective. There's other things to take into account, like recreational value and cultural value and so on. So, we start with the top goal and you work your way down to what is actually achievable, really. In terms of restoring wetlands, how can we convince stakeholders to restore those ecosystems for biological values rather than water quality goals? I think that's really just through good comms, communications, building relationships, and getting the message across that our biodiversity is in a real state of despair. Wetlands in particular are a super valuable ecosystem for biodiversity, and they're more than just, the fact that they filter water is an amazing aspect to them, but they've also got other values besides that. To make sure restoration projects fit with the ecological district species and, where applicable, eco-source, is there easy access information for landowners? I'd say that probably depends on your region or your district. I spend most of my time working up in the Waikato, and there's certainly information available. It's whether people know where to find it, I guess. It's generally pretty accessible. If you did a quick Google search, you'd be able to find some things like the Hamilton Gully Restoration Guide and things like that. But I mean, I say that after 10 years of experience of working in the space, so I know the resources. But I think, yeah, if people were looking for it, they should be able to find it. Where does the money come from to eradicate and manage weeds in these areas? Wherever you can find it, really. We mostly work with the likes of councils, landowners, iwi and community groups. Typically, if it's iwi and community groups, they're looking for funding through contestable funds, whereas councils will typically have some budget for weed management. I would just say the point on eradicating weeds, eradication is very difficult. It's more, unless you've got massive budgets, you really want to just be focusing on suppressing weeds so that the native plants can thrive, really, and dominate the space.
And the last curly one.
Thoughts on councils using MPSIB to map huge areas of poor quality isolated habitats as SNA as opposed to focusing on existing high value areas? I think SNAs will have been mapped for a reason. Whether they, coming back to the point of focusing on the good areas and working your way down to the bad, if they're a small isolated patch of, say, some kakatea or a crappy end of a gully or something like that, it's a bad area relative to the better SNAs. So in terms of prioritising the work, focus on the bigger, better SNAs. I wouldn't say that those SNAs don't have value, though. Typically it'll be for something like a habitat for long-tailed bats or things like that, because they'll use anything with a large tree kind of thing. So it may not seem like it's significant, but it may have a significance for a reason that you're not necessarily aware of.
All right. Well, thank you, Adam.